to Serrin Rutledge-Prior from ANU and Edmund Handby from Duke, who are going to speak on the title ahead of us. So please take it away.
Thank you. Okay, so this paper, as the title, I suppose, fairly obviously suggests, is fundamentally concerned with political representation. Particularly and specifically political representation in the face of increasing concern about climate change and the way that this concern for climate change and environmental politics feeds through into the day-to-day practice of politics. And it's motivated, I suppose, by a number of different other features of this broad framing that we have. So a feature of recent studies on this topic, such as a paper by Ross Smidiger, rely on a distinction between regimes or approaches to governance, and particularly climate governance, that are either framed as authoritarian or liberal democratic. And I suppose one of the original motivations for this paper was the need or want to explore an approach to environmental representation that doesn't necessarily sit in this dichotomy of liberal democratic and authoritarian, but kind of sits or floats somewhere in between them. Kind of a paternalist approach that captures what we might call the allure of authoritarian politics for addressing things like climate emergencies, but are also situated within liberal democratic regimes. And what we arrive at basically is an approach that's inspired by and premised on the ideas of Edmund Burke, and specifically his notion of the virtual representation of interests. Now, some feedback we've gotten previously is that Burke and environmental politics or environmental representation kind of seem like strange bedfellows, in that it's not normally a link that you would sort of make intuitively. But we actually think that Burke can be actually quite useful for thinking about environmental politics. And we're not necessarily alone in this. So Scruton talks about how apt Burke is for thinking about conservation, and Harlan Wilson does as well. So he talks about Burke's preferences for gradual change and how helpful that can be for environmental thought and practice. So we're trying to expand upon this tradition of relying on Edmund Burke for the purposes of environmental politics. Not only is this paper motivated by this question of political representation in the environment, but it's also motivated by this broader project of multi-species justice. So a particularly well-established trend now, I suppose, in political theory is where political theorists are being productive in challenging the normative underpinnings of contemporary and current notions of justice. And they do so by analysing canonical texts in the history of political thought or in the canon with reference to a critical understanding of gender, race, disability, and coloniality. And what we suggest, or what we want to feed into, is this notion that this project is still sort of, not in its infancy, but still developing as it relates to rereading some of the core texts in the Western canon with reference to the environment and reference to non-human animals and environmental phenomena. And so we think that this paper contributes to a commitment to redefining the bounds of things like justice and representation beyond the human, to encompass non-human entities as subjects of justice and representation in their own right. So all of this framing leads us to the central argument and direction of the paper, which is an attempt to outline what we call a Burkean approach to environmental representation. And we think that the approach comes with a number of key benefits, in that it offers a solution to the puzzle of how to represent the interests of entities that cannot, straightforwardly anyway, communicate with us, including those that are not even sort of consciously aware of their own interests. And as I flagged earlier, we arrive at this approach through the way that Burke thinks about how interests are represented in the parliament. And so not only is this approach situated within these debates that I've sort of talked about authoritarian climate governance and multi-species justice, but it is, again, sort of adding on to the layers here, an attempt to sort of overcome some of these key shortcomings, like the communication problem, that are associated with attempts to meaningfully represent the environment in political institutions. So not only do these benefits include the challenge of communication, but also the squeaky wheel problem, as it's known, which is where, in the case of the environment, things like profitable industries are able to shape environmental policy and cause environmental harm despite things like community opposition. So essentially the problem where some squeaks in the wheel aren't being heard due to other factors. Now, one thing we do really want to stress, and this ties into some feedback we've gotten previously, is that we don't necessarily think that this is an ideal or perfect approach to environmental representation. And in a sense, it's not necessarily to try and propose such an ideal. So we do recognize that there are a number of limitations to this approach. Some of them we think are sort of overcomable, for lack of a better word. Some of them aren't as overcomable as I'll get to. But we nonetheless think that this approach that starts with a general characterization of Burke's views can be really helpful despite some potential limitations. And so part of where we get started with the paper is not just diving into Burke's notions of interests specifically, but it starts with a look at the broader purpose of political representation and this notion of the intergenerational social contract, because we think this framing and what Burke is trying to do is really important. So for Burke, the social contract is kind of a vertical relationship. It spans a number of generations of stewards. Each are charged with a long-term preservation of social and economic goods over things like short-term utility maximization. So in other words, Burke thinks that we shouldn't necessarily jeopardize the ability of future people to meet their needs. And this focus on the future ties into his preference for slow or gradual reforms. And so for representatives, this kind of ties into his ideas or his trustee approach to political representation, which means that MPs shouldn't necessarily rely on what he calls the hasty opinions of constituents, as they are more likely to focus on things like short-term utility maximization as opposed to the real good of the community. So that's sort of the general framing that we take and the inspiration in Burke that we think is important. So as it relates to Burke's specific ideas about what he thinks interests are and the way that they're represented. So this notion arises out of his distinction, or the distinction, I suppose, between locations that are represented actually and locations that are represented virtually. So a constituency, for example, is represented actually insofar as it's able to directly elect its own representative to the parliament. So Bristol is actually represented in the parliament because there is a member for Bristol. Relatively straightforward. The purpose of virtual representation and where virtual representation becomes important is for instances where a town or a locality of any kind doesn't elect its own member directly. So in an actual sense, it has no representation. But what that means is we need some other mechanism for ensuring that locality is represented in the parliament. And what he says is, and what Burke says, is that this occurs via a locality without an actual representative and a locality with an actual representative sharing in some shared thing, basically. And what this thing is an interest. So Burke outlines a conception of interests that have a number of particular features. So first is that there's a limited number of them. I think in the total list, I think he only mentions like 5 total by name. And they are clearly defined in that he thinks the boundaries of them are quite sharp. They're also geographically tied. So for example, one of the common ones that he talks about is the merchant interest or the trading interest, and he thinks a particular locality is tied to this location. The same with the agricultural interest or any of these other interests that he talks about. They're set in the context of a particular geographic location. And these groups or regions tend to be only associated with one. So it's not like, for example, Birmingham shares in both the merchant interest and the agricultural interest. It's primarily one. As you may have picked up on from some of the examples, they're also primarily economic, though there is an exception here, which I'll get to in a second. And importantly as well, they're non-aggregative or unattached. And what he means by this, by non-aggregative or non-attached, is that for example, the merchant interest isn't an aggregation of the interests of individual merchants. It's just the merchant interest. So in a sense, in his mind, you arrive at these objectively. It's not just a collection of subjective interests. So in this sense, locations don't have an interest, they participate in an interest. So that's what it means to be geographically tied, in that a set geographic area participates in this objective interest. And part of the reason why we think there's some potential here to extend this beyond just the primarily economic focus that Burke has is that he himself mentions, I suppose, a couple of times where there is some potential to apply these to non-economic groups. So he talks about the possibility of Irish Catholics being represented virtually as well. And so this is what allows for virtual representation, this locations sharing in an interest. So Birmingham might not have its own actual member in the parliament, but given both it and Bristol participate in the merchant or trading interest, it is virtually represented as a result. And so what we do is we try and draw an analogy between these kinds of interests with, or these economic interests, and interests centered around environmental phenomena. And the way the paper proceeds is to essentially go through each of these characteristics that Burke outlines and try and draw an equivalence between each of the different kinds. So in the context of them being clearly defined, in one sense, we think is relatively straightforward, in that you can identify things like a rainforest interest or a desert interest. Or if you want to get a little bit more specific, we can demarcate something like a Daintree rainforest interest from the not Daintree rainforest, or the Sahara Desert from the not Sahara Desert, that kinds of things. But also we can distinguish different kinds of environmental interests at sort of different levels of abstraction, but also different kinds. So we know relatively clearly that the interests of coral reefs, or the coral reef interest, is distinct from the rainforest interest. So we think that's relatively straightforward. In terms of these environmental interests being tied to a geographic location, I think we also think that this is relatively straightforward. So rainforests, deserts, coral reefs, whatever sort of interest you want to think about, they're all tied to a geographic area. There's a boundary to them. That isn't to say that there might not, that there might be some vagueness at these boundaries for sure, but we think that this is something that can be overcome with reference to something like ecological and geographic knowledge. That when we do geography, we're able to demarcate at least some clear line between them. Now, this does raise some questions about the level of abstraction that you define an interest at. In that, again, you could define a interest relatively specifically, such as the Amazon rainforest interest, or more broadly, the rainforest interest. So there are a couple of different candidates and ways that you could identify the relevant interest. And as we go into a little bit in the paper, the extent to which you might prioritize or identify one interest or one level of abstraction over another ties into the particular political system that you're dealing with. One part where this becomes a real problem that we sort of admit is as it relates to much broader or much more, I suppose, abstract environmental phenomena like the atmosphere or the climate. And in cases such as these, the application becomes a little bit fuzzier, but I will get back into this limitation a little bit down the line. And then the non-aggregative unattached condition. This basically asks us to think of environmental interests in a holistic sense, which is to say that just as the merchant interest isn't the aggregation of the interests of merchants, an environmental interest is not merely an aggregation of the interests of individuals and specific entities within it. Now, this is, again, sort of tied into this question about the level of abstraction. So if we define the interest narrowly, such as the Amazon rainforest interest, we might say that the various regions that make up the Amazon participate in that interest. Or alternatively, we might say that the Amazon rainforest interest isn't just an aggregation of all the interests of the various flora and fauna and so on that live in it, but is instead, it's something that those various flora and fauna participate in. And then at a different level of abstraction, you might define a rainforest interest in a broader sense, and all of the individual rainforests around the world or in a particular region might participate in that broader interest. So again, there is some fuzziness here, but we don't think that this is necessarily fatal to this sort of idea. And in fact, despite this fuzziness, we suggested an application of Burke's thought to the environment forms the basis for conceptualizing how environmental interests can be represented in democratic institutions. So a member of parliament or Congress or whatever would actually represent their constituencies, as well as virtually representing the environmental phenomena that their constituency participates in. So an example, Bernie Sanders, for example, as the US Senator for the US state of Vermont, provides the humans of Vermont with actual representation, and as well as via the interests they take part in. So our claim is that this kind of representation can encompass other entities, and that we can regard a range of non-humans, both animal and plant, as participating in a variety of interests alongside humans. And extending this view in this way to environmental regions and entities, what we think provides a grounding for the claim that there sort of is already a duty of political representatives to advocate for environmental interests, in which their constituencies, again, both human and non-human, take part. And what we think is important here is that it doesn't necessarily require that the environment or environmental interests or entities need to have their own specific political representatives, separate from those who already exist in particular political institutions and jurisdictions. So with all of that said, what I want to go through now, that's the basic framework of the approach, is a general analogy between this conception of interests, which are primarily economic, to a more environmental focus. And then, so the way the paper is sort of structured is to go through a set of issues, some limitations, but also some of the key benefits of the approach. One of the first central objections is this notion of participating in an interest. So again, recall that Burke sees interests as non-aggregative, so that people participate in the interest rather than necessarily having them. Still, the problem is that participating in an interest arguably requires having an interest that corresponds to the interest that they participate in. So an example, it would make not very much sense to say that an individual who follows the Islamic faith and therefore has no particular interest in the existence or nature of Roman Catholicism participates in a Roman Catholic interest. So the analogy here with the environment, if the trees in the Daintree rainforest have no interest or no interest that they can communicate that corresponds to the Daintree rainforest interest, how can we see them as participating in it? And so there are two potential responses here. One response, a potential response, is to say that we just take an I don't know how to say this word, a human centered approach, and just focus on the humans that participate in it. However, just as a general rule and following this theme of multi-species justice, we think that this is a pretty ordinary approach or response, particularly given that we believe environmental interests are worth representation in and of themselves. And secondly, we don't really see any real basis for the prioritization of humans over other entities. A more coherent response, I think, is to analogize environmental entities with corporations. So while individuals participate in corporations as shareholders, no particular aggregation of shareholders is constitutive of the corporation itself, which is recognized as a legal person in its own right. Yet if corporations are independent of the sentient, interest-bearing human individuals that make them up, well, how can then a corporation be said to have interests of its own, much less interests that are interpretable in a political or legal context? And And there's I think, quite a good quote here from Stone, who basically says that, despite this idea that environmental interests are quite hard to understand or to have communicated to us, we can actually interpret them pretty easily, and in a lot of cases, a lot more easier than the myriad of legal concepts that make up the world. And the second sort of more coherent response is more of just an outright rejection of the human-centric view. And this view rejects the kind of worldview that denies the interests of other than human beings. So there isn't really any serious doubt anymore that many, if not most, non-human animals are sentient beings with interests, desires, and preferences, the fulfillment or denial of which, all else being equal, provides them with a better or worse experience of life. And in this part of the paper, we draw on various indigenous intellectual traditions from around the world that view non-human animals and natural entities such as rivers, mountains, trees, and having not only their own inherent value, but also sentience and agency. And all of this leads to conclude that there is no real conceptual trouble in claiming that environmental phenomena such as flora or fauna are able to participate in an environmental interest. So with this general objection dealt with, I do want to quickly move to some of the benefits of the approach. So both of these I've flagged already, and the first one is the communication problem. So one of the fundamental problems that is central to environmental representation is, again, this notion of communication and how the environmental phenomena can meaningfully communicate their preferences. And we think that this is where the Burkean aversion to mandate-driven representation is actually quite important, in that it allows us to sort of avoid this concern. So because the interests are conceptualized in terms of how the representative perceives them, so part of Burke's claim is that members of parliament are members of a kind of natural aristocracy with this greater capacity for wisdom and judgment. Burke's account shifts the onus from the represented in being able to articulate their interests. Now, this is contingent upon the general sort of premise that environmental phenomena can't communicate with us. And we touch on a little bit as well here, some scholars like Stone and John Dryzek as well, who have outlined ways by which environmental systems can communicate us in meaningful ways. The second benefit that we see in this account based on Burke is in relation to this squeaky wheel problem. So again, this problem arises or manifests where things like profitable industries are given license to do things to the environment, cause environmental harm, despite things like local community outcry. And more resource-rich communities are able to avoid or minimize their exposure to impacts of environmental degradation and hazards at the expense of something like poorer neighbors. So in the context of the environment, the squeaks in the wheel are easier to ignore than those of humans a lot of the time. Under Burke's account, however, the representative has a duty not to be swayed by the shifting desires of the constituency. Again, coming back to the broader framing of the paper. But instead, Burke's representative has this duty to be guided by his unbiased opinions, his mature judgment, and his enlightened conscience. So since it is the role of the representative to ensure the interests of all constituents, interests that are, again, not connected to any particular individual, the representative must pay no more attention or heed to the loudest, most persistent, or the most numerous groups of voices among his constituency than he would, say, the softest or fewest in number. So we think that this is quite important. Before wrapping up, I'm not doing okay for time, I think. Before wrapping up, I just want to focus in on one of the, I suppose, one of the more pertinent limitations, which is kind of about generalization. And I mentioned this earlier in the context of environmental phenomena and ideas like the atmosphere or the climate itself. And this claim or this objection is basically that some environmental phenomena are much more nebulous than rainforests in interests. So as Stone puts it, the climate, for example, is a pretty shifty client. So how can we view it through the lens of Burke's account of interest when it isn't geographically tied in a similar way to something like a rainforest and isn't necessarily sort of clearly defined in a similar way as well? Similarly, you might ask about the question of who participates in the climate interest. Is it just all of us? Now, that might not be a problem, or you might say, well, yeah, sure, of course it does. But that sort of, to me anyway, makes the rigor of the application to more nebulous environmental phenomena like this sort of lose a bit of force. So addressing this challenge through the Burkean lens, I think, is pretty tough and presents, in the minds of the paper anyway, sort of one of the foremost limitations on the account. So wrapping up, I just want to return again to sort of reinforce the purpose of the paper. And so with this shortcoming in mind and this limitation, the purpose isn't to outline a perfect or ideal approach to environmental representation based on Burke, but instead we want to show what it looks like for political theorists to imagine new forms of deliberation and representation that capture non-human environmental entities. And again, in this respect, we want to follow the footsteps of the Multi-Species Justice Project. And part of this involves reimagining central Western figures like Burke and the ideas that they outline through the lens of multi-species justice, and as a means of not only rejecting kind of the human, non-human binary in traditional Western thought, but also we hope to provide a new interpretation of a particular historical thinker. And given Burke's status as, in some minds, the father of modern conservatism, we think that this can help promote the development of a kind of overlapping green consensus between liberal, progressive, and conservative traditions. So with that, I will finish there and look forward to questions and comments.
Great, thank you very much, Edmund. So I think I think Serrin will want to sort of come in response to questions rather than be forced to, unless you want to add anything right now. Okay, good.
No, I think Ed did a great job.
I agree. So I've got a few questions, but we already have one person who wants to ask a question. So Ima, sorry, I don't know if I pronounced your name correctly. If not, apologies. But anyway, please go ahead and ask your question.
So, hi, this is me, Ima Hassan, and I want to ask what about the environmental issues and political representation, keeping it aside, and if we look into the figures that because I actually live in the most polluted city of the world, that is Lahore. So what do you think, like, if we take the examples of these countries and they're not progressive and they're not that representative in terms of greenery and the climate, we experience a lot of issues regarding that. So what is the comment on this thing? Because if we're not taking and considering the figures that are very crucial, not for us, but for also our future generations as well. Because if we're going to raise our families here, we definitely have to worry for their existence as well. That's the question.
Thank you. Either of you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. It is, obviously a very, very important one. And I think though this goes sort of beyond the scope of this paper, we do think, as other authors have briefly touched on, I mean, Ed mentioned Roger Scruton, has spoken a little bit about Burke in the context of the environment. But we think figures like Burke can be useful for thinking about these sort of issues of, long-term environmental degradation. So Burke has a really strong focus on the idea of there being an intergenerational sort of social contract the idea that you need to keep things in trust for future generations, that you are in this kind of sort of, well, contract with your ancestors, with you know, your children, your grandchildren, and that kind of lends itself to a long-termism way of thinking that, you know, arguably isn't captured by a lot of liberal democratic politics today. So yeah, though we don't really focus on that aspect in this specific paper, yeah, I think Burke, for all his many flaws, and there are many, you know, we can kind of draw a certain degree of inspiration from his idea of, from his kind of long-termist ideas in relation to the environment, where we really do need to be thinking in the long term, and, you know, not just in terms of 3-year election cycles. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Okay, thanks, Serrin. So I think we have Antoinette first, and then after her, Andre. Antoinette, please.
Right. Thank you so much for the paper. I really think this is extremely interesting. I mean, it's an extremely timely issue, but I think bringing this historical approach to it is very neat. I have to say, I have no clue about Burke, and I really just want to understand the approach a bit better, because I think I'm still struggling with the idea of representation, so the very fundamental concept that you have in the paper. So if you could just help me to understand better. So my issue is the one when you're saying, right, these are in a way objective interests, and they're somehow tied to the location and somehow tied to the nation, but it's not really the individuals who have these specific interests, right? It's not aggregative. So I understand that it's not aggregative, so that much is clear. But so it still seems to me that they are somehow tied back to the people. So even if not the individual, at least the nation in some kind of a way, and like something like that. So how much is there a connection, and how does this connection actually work? Because then when you later talk about questions of whether corporations also have interests, then I was getting a little bit suspicious, right? So I think often when we talk about these issues from a more liberal perspective, right, we say things like, well, states don't have interests in the normative sense by themselves. It's actually only the interests of the individuals, and then also through the collective, that gives them the normative status. And then we might think like, oh, but corporations are the wrong kind of a thing to have an interest in itself. So it's only what it does for individuals or society at large that gives it any normative meaning, right? So that's the kind of tension that I feel, and I just think I'm missing something there. If you could explain that again. Thank you.
Thanks, Antoinette.
I can take this one. Yeah, so to me, I mean, this is kind of weird to me as well, what Burke says about this particular idea of interests. I think he's at pains to essentially just try and come at the problem in a way that divorces it from the opinions of people. So the way that it relates to the people itself, when he talks about it in this way as participating in the interest, in that the locations and the people participate in this interest. I mean, he's trying to say that, yeah, we've almost like got your best interests in mind, given what you as a region sort of care about. So in a sense, he's kind of making like there are particular different varieties of what constitutes the common good that are tied to these various regions. So Bristol participating in the merchant interest is really reliant on merchants doing well. So he wants to try and capture it in that sense, as far as I understand, but not make it reliant on just what merchants happen to think is good for merchants on a day-to-day basis. Because he thinks that merchants essentially won't be able to won't have a good enough sense of what constitutes the objective interest of merchants, because they can get it wrong, or that their opinions can be hasty or change on a day-to-day basis. So he's trying to come at this as a lens of, in this, again, paternalist sense of, there is something here that is objectively good for you as a class, or good for you given what your economic status is. But but also wants to make sure that that's not reliant on what the people happen to think that that is, given their propensity to be wrong, but also given what he thinks about the mental capacity for judgment of representatives. That representatives are able to discern what the objective good for merchants is in a way that the common folk won't be able to. So in one sense, it's confusing because it's confusing, because he's trying to paint, I think he's trying to walk a particular tightrope between saying, hey, here's how we get to this notion of virtual representation, and here's how we go about this project. But again, trying to avoid any sort of reliance on the subjective opinions of individuals, if that makes sense, and if that helps.
Yeah, if I can come back just very quickly, I think that does help. I think then it's probably also not as far away from ideas that we might know from Rousseau or even Raz in a way, right? So maybe that would be good to point out. I still think that just in terms of the paper, I would rethink whether you really want to taking the corporation example, because I still think that even if we believe that there's something like objective interests that you might be mistaken about yourself, that corporations are probably not doing that thing in the way that you're thinking about, or that sounds now, it's probably not capturing the Burkean kind of a.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that might be helpful. And yeah, Serrin, maybe that's something we can think about with that example. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, next we have Andre.
Hey, thanks so much. Really exciting. So I'm a bit puzzled about this non-aggregative conception of interest, and so two specific questions there. And if there's time for a second question, but Jonathan, you can cut me. So I'm wondering how, on a non-aggregative conception, do you get to determine the weight or the degree to which an interest is represented? So what does it mean to say that interests, given a plurality of interests, are not sufficiently represented, that there are failures of representation in terms of either over-representation or under-representation if we don't go about it aggregatively? So how does this cash out? This seems to be a categorical conception of an interest is either represented or not, and that just seems puzzling. And also more specifically about time, how does this idea of time play into the weighing of an interest across time? If you take the example of Bristol or another community and economic interests, and short versus long-termism, can the weight of any particular interest vary across time? I'll just leave it at that, and if there's a time later on, ask the other question. Thanks. But really exciting.
Thank you. So I think the way Burke would resolve this, I don't want to say is relatively straightforward, but I think he's at pains to set up. So first, I don't think he goes into a lot of the specifics about how they're weighed or whether or not they might compete. I think he just views it, I don't want to say one-dimensionally, but kind of one-dimensionally, in that there are these set number of interests and they don't really overlap. They're all kind of fixed. We can clearly define them. And at the end of the day, because of the way representation works, they've got a voice in the parliament. I think this thing about waiting and time as well, I think probably just comes back to his characterization of the parliament as a deliberative body, and MPs as having, again, this sort of greater capacity for deliberation and for wisdom and judgment, that any of these sorts of potential issues about clashes of interests or the shifting of interests or whatever, I think you would just say, well, yeah, but Parliament's deliberative, so they'll figure it out, in a sense, because a lot of the quotes that he has when he talks about this, he's very much at pains to say Parliament is deliberative, and here's what deliberative means, and that they'll figure it out. So I suppose part of what ties into this is that, as I understand Burke anyway, Burke thinks that there are right and wrong answers in politics, and that the combination of the deliberative nature of the parliament plus this sort of enlightened status of parliamentarians, throw that all sort of in a blender and you'll get to the right answer eventually. Even though that might not be necessarily a or that, there's a lot of assumptions tied in there for sure. I think that's how he would deal with it. How we should deal with it in the context of environmental interests, I can't say I have a clear idea. And I think that's part of where a lot of this fuzziness comes in that, a lot of, and maybe this is outside of the scope of the paper sort of thing as well, but we sort of, for the most part, take Burke at his word on the way he talks about duties of representatives and the way that representatives will go about it. Now, yes, you can critique that for sure, as we all have good reason to a lot of the time. But for the interpretive purposes of the paper, we're just sort of generally accepting this characterization of the parliament and of MPs as he talks about it. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Okay, next we have Ted with a question.
Great. So love the paper, love the project. I have a question and a suggestion. And the question, I think all of us are really hung up on the issue of interests here, because that's on, what everything turns on. So specifically the sort of metaphysics and ontology of Burke's notion of interests. So I can get on board with the idea that interests are not subjective, they are objective. And perhaps I missed this in the presentation, but does that mean we should understand interests as natural kinds? Or how exactly do we derive or understand the nature of interests? Do we do some kind of philosophical anthropology? What exactly, is the sort of epistemology, if you will, of interests? That's something that I'm struggling with, in addition to some of the other questions, how do we aggregate them? And I can understand, what it means to participate in an interest, but where do these interests come from is what I'm struggling with. And this leads to a suggestion, which you might think about for potentially strengthening the paper. And the suggestion would be to engage with the idea of, what do we want from a satisfactory account of interests? What are the criteria that we should be looking for and grading an account on? And if you could, establish some criteria and then grade Burke in light of those criteria, I think it would help to see, the strengths of his account and where it might fall short.
I think those are really important questions, and they are ones that we really had to, kind of grapple with as we were writing the paper. And I think, really delving into Burke and seeing how he conceptualizes of interests is important. And I think we have tried to do that, and to the extent that it's maybe not altogether clear, maybe that's a reflection of how it's not always altogether clear in Burke. And yeah, sort of as Ed said, we're trying to take Burke at his word. We're trying to work with what he has given us, even though it is maybe not always as clear as it could be, and really just try to prove that, you know, if Burke has been influential in a particular way, if we think that there is something that is you know, good about his ideas in relation to economic interests, even though what that is might be a bit fuzzy on his own account, then it does seem to lend itself quite well to environmental interests as well. Even though, again, the sort of ontological underpinnings of what interests is maybe not as clear as it could have been. And that's definitely a question that I would be taking up, you know, with Burke himself if I had that opportunity. But yeah, these points are really important, and I think, yeah, the risk that I would see is that we would, in trying to provide a stronger underpinning, we would be then maybe going beyond what Burke himself has given us, and at least for the purposes of this project, we kind of want to keep it within the bounds of Burke, even if, again, it's a bit fuzzy. Yeah, Ed, do you want to take over?
Oh, I was going to say something relatively similar, in that I do really like the idea of evaluating Burke on interests, and you know, part of, as I mentioned, is that this isn't necessarily an attempt to outline a perfect account of the representation of environmental interests. But I think something like outlining an account of what we want from a satisfactory account of interests would be really helpful in pursuing that project. But again, as Serrin talked about, the challenge is, you know, because, as a bit of an aside, in developing this paper, we've cycled through like 7 different framings and 7 different ways of sort of like coming at the question. And our concern would be, a concern I could see with the suggestion, for the purposes of this paper anyway, would be getting hung up on a different possible entryway to the question. In terms of the metaphysics and ontology thing, that's kind of similar in the, and goes back to what Serrin said about sort of taking Burke at his word, in that I don't think Burke thinks very deeply about these sorts of things. The way I read Burke is just like, hey, here are some interests and here's vaguely what they look like. Off we go. Now, I'm obviously happy to be proven wrong on that. The natural kinds thing is interesting. And maybe that could, and yeah, that might be something I have to think about, because I've written and done stuff on analogizing political concepts and social kinds before. And to me anyway, it's confusing and hard. So it might, I might have to think about that one a little bit more, because part of me can see it, but also knowing the extent of the work that goes into identifying natural kinds, and, you know, the whole externalist dimension of natural kinds, which I tend to subscribe to, is a whole different sort of thing that I don't want to commit to any coherent position on.
Ed, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but we've now got a queue of 3 people.
Oh, yes, sorry, I'll stop.
And officially only 9 minutes left. So if we can keep questions and answers fairly short, that would be great.
Yes.
So I think first in the queue was Ilaria.
Yeah, thank you. It's fascinating. I will be very brief. So as far as I understood, so what you do is to create an analogy between Burke's notions of interest and environmental interests. And I guess my question would be, how making this analogy help the cause of better political representation? Because if I look at like the problem of like representation from the institutional point of view, or responsiveness, as you want to call it, I would say, well, the problem with environmental interests is not that the environmental interests are not well defined, but the problem is there is a clash of interests. Thanks.
Yeah.
Brief answer.
Yes. Very quickly, I mean, this is the classic, like, why should we care sort of question. In a sense of, how does this lead to tangible outcomes? in a sense, the link between what we're trying to show and the sort of real actions of political representatives is tough, I will admit. But I suppose our purpose is to show sort of like a template, or here's the way that we can think about it that doesn't necessarily disrupt existing political institutions. Here's a way that we might, we sort of show a template that we might be able to follow down the line, accepting all of the sorts of things that we ask you to accept in terms of assumptions. Sorry, I hope that helps. I'm just, in the interest of being relatively brief.
Thanks both for your brief question and answer. So I think next we have Laura with a question.
Hi, thanks for a really interesting paper. So very quickly, I wondered if you had considered in the paper the literature on constitutive representation, like people like Lisa Dish and Mike Sayward, because it seems to me that the elitism in Burke actually fits well with this idea that a representative has this capacity to pick up latent constituencies, like can kind of name them and form them in some way around this, common sentiment, to use Burke's language, right? That they can kind of give voice to latent publics or constituencies that might otherwise not have been picked up on. And maybe that helps a little bit with sort of questions of ontology and this kind of thing. So just a thought.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great suggestion. We'll definitely look into that.
What were those names again? Sorry, Lisa
Dish. Yeah. And I think she wrote something in the APSR in 2012, if I'm not mistaken. And Mike Sayward, who has a book on the representative claim, it's called.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we have Ima with a second question, but also Andrew had a second question. Can I just ask, is there anybody who'd like to, who hasn't yet spoken, who'd like to ask a question, just to make it fair? Please don't be shy. We have a few minutes left. Okay, Ima, please go ahead.
Can Mr. Handby please enlighten me on the framework, because I didn't really understand what's the analogy. And the first question was asked by Ilaria, because I just simply couldn't make the connection between how it is related to potential representation in democratic framework.
Yeah, so I suppose we're not necessarily concerned with strict institutional design or what this would look like in a strict institutional or really grounded institutional setting. But what we want to show is that embracing these ideas can lead representatives to meaningfully capture environmental interests within the bounds of existing liberal democratic political institutions. So it's not necessarily about going out to my local MP and saying, hey, accept this argument and now you have to act in X, Y, and Z ways. It's about showing, maybe if to stretch the analogy a bit, showing a representative in a constituency that has something like a wetland or some environmental phenomena, that there is a way to meaningfully represent this environmental entity in a way that doesn't conflict with the way you normally go about things, but it's just capturing a different sort of set of concerns in, again, hopefully a meaningful way. So I suppose in a sense, we are trying to walk a tightrope in talking about how things work in political institutions, but not trying to be so grounded that we're giving like a guidebook, if that helps.
Yeah, and I think it's about maybe encouraging political actors, political representatives to think about their duties as representatives in maybe slightly different ways to what is the dominant norm at the moment. I guess in liberal democracies at the moment. It is about, responding directly to constituencies, just responding to individuals, listening to their voices. And, obviously that is really important. But there are other ways of thinking about being a representative, and Burke, offers one way of thinking about being what it is to be a representative, and that's about representing interests rather than individuals per se. And if we do ascribe to this idea of representing interests, then, alongside these quite anthropocentric interests, why not also think about, make room for these environmental or natural interests?
Thanks. Okay. Andre, do you want to come in very quickly with the second part of your question in 2 minutes?
Yeah, so very, very shortly, I find this very exciting, the idea of using Burke to build a conception of political representation. But I was just wondering, in terms of framing, and this is kind of a predictable question, what role does Burke play there? So how committed you're to Burke? Because it seems that you're kind of balancing sometimes, right? So sometimes you say, well, this is a Burkean conception, but then when you run into trouble and serious objections, then you want to take some distance from it, and it makes sense. So what is the project about a Burkean conception of political representation as interest-based, or is the project an interest-based conception of representation and taking Burke as an entry point into this?
I mean, I'm pretty committed to the whole Burkean thing. I suppose part of the problem is, again, we've sort of cycled through a ton of different framings, and maybe that feeds through in the paper a little bit. We're pretty committed to Burke being central to this. Part of the reason why we do sort of fluctuate between different levels of distance from Burke is trying to show that, there are bits and pieces of it that do and don't work, while still, we don't want to set it up, Burke, as this perfect account, but we don't want to think Burke sucks and it's not worth pursuing it at all. We sort of want to be realistic about the pros and cons of Burke. We try and make our focus, even in addressing objections, we want to be realistic about objections, basically, which is why at times we do seem like we're distancing ourselves from him. But the foremost, I think, project is a Burkean idea, is committing to this Burkean idea.
Yeah, I think it primarily is about, rereading this kind of canonical figure through this kind of multi-species lens, and then, exploring what the limitations, what the bounds of this, what, maybe some of the benefits are, also in order to kind of explore its feasibility. But yeah, the primary goal is about rereading this historical and arguably still influential figure in what we see as a more just and inclusive way.
Okay, thanks very much. I think we're out of time, so please do join me in thanking Ed and Serrin for a really interesting, stimulating paper.
Thank you for having us.
I hope the feedback you got was helpful.
Absolutely.
Great. So just before everybody disappears, let me just do a quick plug for our final political theory seminar of 2023 on the 29th of November, 4 weeks today, when we'll have Gabriele Badano from the University of York in the UK talking about values in science and public reason. But until then, thanks very much, everyone, and see you again.